The first thing people noticed about Carmine Galante wasn't his power. It was his stare. A long, unblinking look that made grown men shift in their chairs and forget what they were about to say. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It was patient, like a man who already knew how the conversation would end and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. On a humid summer night in Brooklyn, long before his name meant anything beyond a few cracked sidewalks and whispered rumors, Carmine stood outside a corner cafe watching the street breathe. Cars rolled by slow. Neon lights flickered. Somewhere down the block, laughter spilled out of an open window. The city never slept, but it always watched. And Carmine, even then, understood one thing better than most. If you wanted to survive New York, you had to learn when to be seen and when to disappear. He was young, but not naive. The son of Italian immigrants, Carmine grew up in a world where money was scarce, respect was currency, and silence could save your life. His neighborhood taught him early that power didn't come from muscles or noise. It came from information, from knowing who owed who, from understanding which doors were locked and which could be opened with the right knock. While other kids chased trouble for fun, Carmine observed. He listened. He remembered names, faces, habits, who talked too much, who drank too much, who got nervous when the police rolled by. These details mattered. Someday, he told himself, they would matter a lot. By the time he reached his 20s, Carmine was already moving differently. He dressed sharper than most, spoke less than others, and never rushed. Men twice his age started noticing him, not because he demanded attention, but because he didn't need it. When he spoke, it was brief. When he promised something, it happened. And when he warned someone, they listened. Brooklyn in those days was a maze of loyalties and quiet battles. Families didn't always fight in the open. They competed through influence, unions, businesses, favors, and connections that stretched from street corners to back rooms across the city. Carmine found his way into this world not by force, but by usefulness. He solved problems. He delivered messages. He smoothed conflicts before they exploded. Older men began testing him, assigning small tasks to see if he'd crack under pressure. He never did. When things went wrong, Carmine didn't panic. He adapted. That calm made him dangerous in a way few people understood at the time. One night, a respected figure pulled him aside after a long dinner that had gone on past midnight. The plates were empty, the wine half finished, and the room thick with smoke and quiet satisfaction. "You don't talk much," the man said. Carmine shrugged lightly. "Nothing to say yet." The man smiled. "That's the right answer." From that moment on, doors opened faster. Carmine began traveling more, sitting in rooms he once only heard about. He learned the rhythm of power, how decisions were made slowly, how grudges aged like wine, how alliances could last years or collapse in a single careless moment. But with opportunity came danger. Law enforcement was paying closer attention to everything and everyone. Names were being written down. Files were being built. Carmine understood this too. He avoided the spotlight, let others take credit, stayed just far enough from the center to remain useful but not visible. Still, ambition has a way of growing quietly. Carmine didn't dream of chaos or headlines. He dreamed of control, of building something so solid it wouldn't need defending every day, of shaping the flow of money and influence without ever raising his voice. By the time the city entered a new era, one louder, faster, and more reckless, Carmine Galante was ready. He had patience, he had memory, and he had a reputation that traveled faster than he did. People began to speak his name carefully, not loudly, not often, but when they did, it carried weight. And Carmine, standing at the edge of it all, watched the city the same way he always had, quietly calculating, waiting, because this was only the beginning. By the early 1950s, New York had changed its rhythm, but Carmine Galante hadn't. He still moved with the same unhurried confidence, as if the city bent slightly around his schedule. While others chased quick money and louder reputations, Carmine focused on building something quieter and far more durable. Influence that stretched beyond neighborhoods and borders. He understood something most men learned too late. Power didn't come from how many people feared you. It came from how many people depended on you. Carmine's rise wasn't sudden. It unfolded like a slow tide. He placed the right men in the right positions, never announcing their purpose, never explaining the bigger picture. One handled logistics, another smoothed relations with unions. Another kept an ear open in places where conversations weren't meant to travel far. None of them knew everything. Only Carmine did. Older bosses watched him carefully. Some admired his discipline. Others felt uneasy, sensing something cold and methodical beneath his calm exterior. Carmine didn't laugh easily. He didn't drink too much. He didn't gossip. When meetings ended, he left first or last, but never lingered. At sit-downs, he spoke just enough to steer the conversation without owning it. If two men argued, Carmine would wait. He'd let tempers flare, let words spill out, then offer a solution so reasonable it felt inevitable. By the time everyone nodded in agreement, they forgot whose idea it had been. Behind closed doors, he studied the shifting landscape. Old alliances were weakening. Younger players were impatient. Law enforcement pressure was increasing, but unevenly. Carmine saw opportunity in that imbalance. If the spotlight was unavoidable, then someone else could stand in it. Around this time, Carmine began traveling more frequently, quietly building connections outside New York. He paid attention to routes, ports, and people who understood movement better than territory. To him, borders were just lines drawn by men who didn't think far enough ahead. Those close to him noticed a change. Carmine was no longer just reacting to the world around him. He was shaping it. Decisions made in distant rooms began echoing back into Brooklyn. Businesses adjusted. Competitors found doors closing without understanding why. One evening, a trusted associate asked him directly, "What's the endgame, Carmine?" Carmine didn't answer right away. He stared out a window at the city lights, blinking slowly. "Stability," he finally said. "For me, for the people who know how to behave." The associate laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke. Carmine didn't smile, but stability in their world always came with resistance. Other families noticed the tightening grip. Whispers began circulating about Carmine's ambition, about his reach, about how much he really controlled. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others quietly prepared. Carmine noticed everything. He knew who questioned him and who watched him too closely. He also knew when patience needed reinforcement. He didn't rush confrontation. He let pressure build naturally, like steam in a sealed room. By the late 1950s, his name carried a different tone. It wasn't just respect anymore, it was caution. Men measured their words more carefully around him. Deals slowed until he weighed in. Silence often followed his presence. And still, Carmine remained largely invisible to the outside world. Newspapers chased flashier figures. Cameras followed louder personalities. Carmine preferred it that way. Power worked best when underestimated. Yet beneath that calm surface, the foundation was being set for something far larger and far more dangerous. A shift was coming. Old rules would be tested. Loyalties would strain. And Carmine Galante, patient as ever, was positioning himself not just to survive it, but to stand above it. This was no longer about rising. It was about ruling. By the time the 1960s rolled in, the streets had grown louder, but Carmine Galante remained unchanged, quiet, deliberate, always watching. The city was shifting fast now. New money moved quicker. New faces talked too much. And the old code that once kept order was starting to fray at the edges. Carmine didn't fight the change. He studied it. Where others saw chaos, he saw leverage. He had learned long ago that the world didn't reward loyalty nearly as much as it rewarded control. So he built systems instead of friendships, pipelines instead of promises. His influence no longer depended on who liked him, but on who needed him to keep things running smoothly. Men who once ignored him now sought his approval. They came carefully, often through intermediaries, offering respect disguised as cooperation. Carmine accepted their gestures without warmth or hostility. He listened, he calculated, and then he decided how useful they could be. Behind the scenes, He became deeply involved in operations that stretched far beyond city blocks. Supply lines mattered more than territory. Timing mattered more than muscle. He focused on consistency, steady flow, minimal disruption. If something drew attention, it was adjusted or quietly replaced. This approach unsettled the older bosses. Carmine didn't fit the traditional mold. He didn't seek consensus. He didn't rely on charm. And he didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. His authority grew not because he demanded obedience, but because resistance became inconvenient. At one closed-door meeting, a senior figure leaned across the table and said, "You're moving too fast, Carmine." Carmine met his eyes without blinking. "No," he replied calmly. "I'm moving before everyone else." The room fell silent. Some respected the confidence. Others took it as a warning. Around this time, Carmine began consolidating his position. More openly, he backed certain leaders and sidelined others, always with plausible explanations. A business wasn't profitable anymore. Partner had become unreliable. A route needed fresh oversight. No accusations, no confrontations. Just quiet reshuffling that left him closer to the center every time. Those pushed aside felt it immediately. Income dried up. Calls went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. Carmine didn't need to punish anyone. Isolation did the work for him. Yet his growing dominance came with risk. The authorities had begun mapping networks instead of chasing individuals. They followed patterns. And Carmine, careful as he was, had begun leaving a shape too large to ignore. He responded by stepping back in public while tightening control in private. New faces appeared as intermediaries. Old connections were rerouted. Carmine's name appeared less frequently, but his decisions echoed everywhere. Privately, some of his closest associates noticed a shift in his demeanor. He slept less. He spoke even less. His patience, once legendary, now had an edge to it. Not anger, but certainty. The kind that came from believing there was no longer anyone above you. One night, alone in his apartment, Carmine stood by the window, watching the city lights stretch toward the horizon. He thought about how far he'd come and how far he intended to go. He didn't celebrate. He didn't reflect with nostalgia. He simply assessed. Power was within reach now. Not borrowed. Not shared. Taken. But Carmine also understood something crucial. The higher you stood, the fewer places there were to hide. Allies would test him. Rivals would gamble. And somewhere in the background, unseen eyes were patiently recording every move. Still, he didn't hesitate, because Carmine Galante had never believed in balance, only dominance. And the city, whether it knew it or not, was about to feel the weight of that belief. The pressure began quietly. It wasn't sirens or headlines or sudden knockdowns at the door. It was subtler than that. A meeting that never happened. A shipment delayed without explanation. A trusted contact who suddenly became cautious, choosing words too carefully, as if every sentence had weight. Carmine noticed everything. He had trained himself to read the absence of noise as closely as the noise itself. And now the silence around him felt different. Thicker, heavier. Someone was paying attention. Maybe more than one someone. Still, he moved forward. By the late 1960s, Carmine's influence was no longer debated in whispers. It was acknowledged, even if reluctantly. He had positioned himself as indispensable, and that was the most dangerous kind of power. Others might hold titles, but Carmine held leverage. Decisions flowed through him whether his name was spoken or not. Yet this rise unsettled the old equilibrium. Carmine's style, direct, unyielding, unapologetic, clashed with men who preferred subtlety and tradition. Where they valued consensus, he valued efficiency. Where they waited for approval, he acted first and explained later. Resentment began to form. Not loud resentment, careful resentment. Certain leaders started holding conversations Carmine wasn't invited to. Alliances shifted slightly, then a little more. He wasn't excluded outright, but the circle around him narrowed just enough to be noticed. Carmine responded the only way he knew how, by tightening control. He reduced reliance on anyone whose loyalty felt uncertain. He elevated men who owed him directly, people whose success was tied entirely to his favor. He centralized operations further, streamlining everything until fewer hands touched the core. To some, it looked like confidence. To others, it looked like arrogance. And arrogance in their world was often corrected. Meanwhile, law enforcement interest continued to grow. Carmine wasn't careless, but patterns had a way of surfacing no matter how disciplined the operator. Investigators didn't need to understand the whole picture anymore. They just needed enough fragments to justify attention. Carmine knew this. He adjusted accordingly. Meetings became shorter. Communication became indirect. He spent more time alone, thinking several moves ahead, calculating risks with cold precision. But even the sharpest minds can misjudge one thing, the human element. Some of the men around Carmine began to feel overshadowed. Others felt cornered. They had grown wealthy under his system, but wealth without autonomy breeds quiet frustration. And frustration, when left unchecked, turns into something else. One evening, after a long day of discussions that led nowhere, Carmine sat back in his chair and studied the faces around the table. No one met his eyes for long. They nodded. They agreed. They waited for him to speak. He understood then. They weren't following him anymore because they believed in his vision. They were following him because they feared the alternative. Fear could hold an empire together, but it could also crack it from the inside. Still, Carmine didn't soften. He didn't reach out. He didn't reassure. In his mind, power was not a conversation. It was a fact. Outside, the world continued to change. Younger men rose faster. Rules bent more easily. Loyalty became transactional. And the old structures that once protected figures like Carmine began to weaken. He stood at the center of it all, calm on the surface, calculating beneath. But for the first time in years, the path ahead wasn't entirely clear. Not because Carmine Galante had lost control, but because too many others wanted it back. By the time Carmine realized how far the ground beneath him had shifted, the shift was already complete. What unsettled him most wasn't opposition from rivals or pressure from the outside world. He had expected those things all his life. What troubled him was the calm with which others now spoke around him, the rehearsed patience in their voices, the way decisions seemed to settle before he arrived in the room. It was subtle, but Carmine had never needed things spelled out. He was being managed, not openly, not disrespectfully, but carefully, like a force that had become too strong to confront directly. Conversations happened without him, then were presented as conclusions rather than discussions. Agreements were framed as necessities. Compromises appeared inevitable, not optional. Carmine listened. He nodded. He said little, and he remembered everything. He knew the men who smiled too quickly. He noticed who no longer sought his approval, only his acknowledgement. Power, he understood, had started to redistribute itself quietly, flowing away from him in small, almost polite increments. Still, he refused to retreat. Carmine believed that history rewarded those who stood firm. He had survived too much by yielding nothing. To bend now, after everything he had built, felt unthinkable. If others wanted to test him, then the test would reveal who truly belonged at the center. So he pressed forward. He asserted himself more openly. He spoke with finality. He reminded people, without threats, without raised voices, of how things had been done and why they had worked. He framed his authority as stability itself, a necessary anchor in a world growing increasingly unpredictable. Some listened, others merely waited. Outside the rooms where decisions were made, stories began to circulate. Not accusations, just impressions. That Carmine was becoming inflexible, that he was out of step, that his methods belonged to another era. Carmine heard the rumors and dismissed them. He had lived through worse than gossip. Words didn't frighten him. What he underestimated was fatigue. Men who had once relied on Carmine's strength began to feel worn down by it. His certainty left no room for ambition. His dominance allowed no room for growth. Even loyalty over time can feel like confinement. And confinement makes people. restless. As months passed, Carmine's presence became paradoxical. He was still powerful, still respected, still feared, but increasingly isolated. Allies treated him like a monument, admired, undeniable, but immovable. The world around him continued to adapt, while he remained exactly who he had always been. One evening, after a meeting that ended without confrontation but also without resolution, Carmine walked alone through quiet streets. The city felt different now, less familiar, less responsive to his presence. Not hostile, just distant. For the first time, he wondered whether holding his ground was enough. He had spent his life believing that power, once taken, could be held indefinitely through will alone. But power, he was beginning to understand, also depended on perception. And perception could change faster than loyalty. Carmine returned home that night unsettled, though he would never admit it aloud. Because somewhere beyond his sight, decisions were forming, slowly, carefully, and without his consent. And once set in motion, they would be impossible to stop. The weeks that followed moved with an uneasy rhythm, like a song that had lost its melody but kept playing anyway. Carmine could feel it in the air. The phone rang less often. When it did, the conversations were brief, careful, almost scripted. Men who once lingered to talk now found reasons to leave early. Meetings ended faster than they used to, as if everyone had already agreed on what needed to happen, except him. Still, no one challenged him directly. That was the most dangerous part. In Carmine's world, open defiance could be handled. It revealed intention. Silence, on the other hand, hid too much. Silence allowed plans to grow without resistance. He spent more time alone, replaying old moments in his mind. He thought back to the years when he had clawed his way upward, when survival demanded adaptability, when hesitation meant being forgotten. Back then, he had watched older. Figures cling to their authority while the world shifted beneath them. He had sworn he would never become one of them. And yet here he was. Carmine didn't believe he had lost his edge. His instincts were sharp. His understanding of people, of leverage, of fear and respect, those things hadn't dulled. But the environment had changed. The rules were no longer unwritten traditions passed quietly between men who trusted one another. They were becoming strategies, negotiations, and alliances that rewarded flexibility over force. Flexibility had never been Carmine's strength. He attempted briefly to adjust. He delegated more, listened longer, allowed conversations to unfold without immediately steering them. On the surface, it looked like compromise, but those around him sensed the restraint behind it. They could tell it wasn't natural, and people trusted instincts more than appearances. Meanwhile, pressure from outside forces continued to build. Carmine was careful, always had been, but attention had a way of accumulating. Patterns, once invisible, started to form shapes others could see. The margins for error narrowed. Those who once relied on Carmine's decisiveness now worried that his presence attracted too much focus. The same authority that had protected them before now felt like a spotlight they couldn't escape. Behind closed doors, conversations turned more serious. What would the future look like if Carmine remained where he was? No one said it outright, but the question hung heavy in every room. Carmine sensed it. He felt the distance growing between him and the men who once mirrored his confidence. He noticed how often his name was spoken cautiously, how suggestions were phrased as concerns rather than opposition. He responded by standing taller. He reminded people subtly of his history, of how long he had lasted, of the stability his leadership had provided. He spoke not as a man defending his position, but as one preserving order. But the effect was not what he intended. Instead of reassurance, his words sounded like reminders of a past others were ready to move beyond. Where Carmine saw continuity, they saw stagnation. Late one night, unable to sleep, Carmine sat alone and considered a truth he had avoided for months. Power does not disappear all at once. It erodes, slowly, quietly, until one day the title remains but the authority does not. That realization unsettled him more than any threat ever had. Because threats could be confronted. Erosion could not. The next morning, Carmine stepped back into his routine with the same outward confidence he always carried. His voice was steady, his posture unchanged. To anyone watching, he was still very much in control. But beneath that surface, the world had already begun to prepare for a version of the future where Carmine Galante was no longer at the center of it. And whether he accepted it or not, the momentum was no longer his to command. By the time Carmine understood that momentum had turned into inevitability, the city itself seemed to carry the message. He felt it when he walked familiar streets and noticed how little his presence stirred the air. Years earlier, a glance, a pause, a subtle shift in posture would ripple outward. People adjusted without thinking. Now, the world moved on its own schedule. Respect remained, but urgency did not. And urgency was power. Carmine adjusted his pace, his routines, his expectations. He began to wake earlier, filling the quiet hours with thought. Not planning in the way he once had, mapping outcomes, assigning roles, but reflecting. He replayed conversations from years ago, moments he had dismissed as minor, decisions that felt justified at the time. In hindsight, some of them carried more weight than he had ever given them credit for. He realized something uncomfortable. The system he had built was strong, but it was also rigid. It worked perfectly as long as everyone accepted his position at the center. Once that acceptance weakened, the structure offered little flexibility. It didn't bend. It resisted, and resistance created pressure. Those closest to Carmine sensed the change in him, even if they couldn't name it. He spoke less, listened more. When he did speak, his words were measured, careful not to reveal uncertainty. But uncertainty has a presence of its own. It lingers in pauses, in glances held too long, in questions left unanswered. At meetings, Carmine noticed that discussions now followed a predictable pattern. Topics were raised, explored briefly, then redirected. Solutions appeared quickly, often framed as consensus. His role had shifted from decision-maker to final voice, a symbolic approval rather than a guiding force. He accepted this outwardly. Inside, it unsettled him deeply. Carmine had never been a man driven by recognition alone. Power, to him, wasn't about admiration. It was about control over outcomes, knowing that events would unfold as he intended. Now, outcomes were being shaped elsewhere, and he was expected to accept them as inevitabilities. He did not accept inevitability easily. For a time, he considered pushing back. Not openly, not dramatically, but strategically. He thought about reasserting himself, reminding certain individuals of the balance that still existed, the consequences of miscalculation. The pieces were still there, the knowledge, the history, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was intuition, perhaps fatigue, or perhaps it was the quiet understanding that power reclaimed too late often returns in a diminished form. Carmine sensed that forcing the issue now would not restore his position. It would only confirm what others already believed, that he belonged to the past. Instead, he observed. He watched how alliances formed without friction, how newer figures navigated conversations with ease, how they balanced ambition with caution in ways that felt foreign to him. They spoke a different language, not one of loyalty or tradition, but of adaptability. Carmine had always trusted structure. These men trusted movement. As weeks passed, he felt the circle tighten, not around him, but away from him. He was still included, still consulted, still respected. Yet decisions no longer depended on his approval. They anticipated it, or bypassed it altogether. One evening, after another meeting that left him feeling more like a witness than a participant, Carmine walked alone through the city once more. The lights glowed softly, indifferent to his thoughts. Life continued uninterrupted, unaware of internal shifts taking place behind closed doors. For the first time, Carmine allowed himself to consider a future where he was not central. It wasn't fear that surfaced. It was something closer to disbelief. He had shaped his entire identity around presence, being seen, being known, being unavoidable. The idea of becoming peripheral felt unreal, like imagining the city without streets. Yet reality had a way of asserting itself whether welcomed or not. As he returned home that night, Carmine understood that the next chapter would not be written by force or resistance. It would be written by how quietly, how gracefully, or how stubbornly. He chose to exist within a world that was already moving past him. And in that realization, the true test of his legacy began. The shift from center to margin didn't happen all at once. It settled into Carmine's life the way twilight settles over a city. Slowly, almost politely, until one day you realize the light has changed and there's no going back. Carmine continued to appear where he always had. He dressed the same, carried himself the same, spoke with the same controlled authority. To an outsider, nothing looked different, but those closest to the inner workings could feel it. The rhythm had changed. The pauses between decisions grew longer. The certainty that once anchored every conversation now floated, unmoored. What unsettled Carmine most was how little resistance there was to this new order. No arguments, no dramatic breaks, just quiet adjustments. Men adapted without complaint, as if they had been waiting for permission to move on. He began to realize that loyalty, once absolute, had become conditional. Not out of betrayal, but out of practicality. People aligned themselves with what felt stable, and stability was no longer synonymous with his name. This understanding forced Carmine inward. He spent long hours alone, not scheming, not planning, but remembering. He thought of the younger version of himself, sharp-eyed, restless, hungry. That man had watched older figures cling to relevance while the world passed them by. He had judged them harshly, convinced that strength alone could prevent decline. Now he understood what they had felt. It wasn't weakness that overtook them. It was time. Time didn't announce itself. It didn't challenge you directly. It simply introduced alternatives, new voices, new methods, new priorities, until your way was no longer the only way. Carmine tried, quietly, to reconnect. He reached out to a few individuals he had once mentored, hoping shared history might reopen doors. The conversations were respectful, even warm, but they ended where they began. No renewed influence. No restored footing. History, he realized, was not currency. It was context. Meanwhile, the external world pressed closer. The atmosphere around him felt tighter, more watchful. Carmine wasn't careless, but awareness alone could no longer shield him from attention. The era of invisibility he had mastered was fading, replaced by systems and structures that didn't rely on intuition or tradition. This concerned others more than it concerned him. People began to see his presence not just as diminished, but as risky. His name carried weight, but also history, and history attracted scrutiny. That realization deepened the distance. Carmine noticed how often decisions were framed around long-term protection and future stability. Words that sounded reasonable, even responsible. But beneath them lay a simple truth. The future they envisioned did not revolve around him. One evening, during a gathering that felt more ceremonial than necessary, Carmine sat quietly while others spoke. He listened to ideas that echoed his own from years earlier, repackaged in softer language. He watched younger men nod confidently, unaware of how closely they mirrored the version of himself they no longer needed. And for the first time, he didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. Carmine understood then that his power had never truly belonged to him. It had been borrowed from circumstances, from timing, from a world that once required someone exactly like him. That world was changing, and it no longer required the same answers. The question was no longer whether he could stop what was happening. The question was how he would meet it. He could resist, cling to position, force relevance, demand acknowledgement. Or he could recede with dignity, preserving what remained of his name rather than exhausting it in a struggle already decided. That choice weighed heavily on him. As days passed, Carmine grew quieter, not withdrawn but measured. He spoke only when necessary. He observed more than he directed. Some mistook this for acceptance. Others mistook it for calculation. In truth, it was neither. It was recognition. Carmine Galante, who had once shaped outcomes with unwavering confidence, now stood at the edge of a chapter closing, not with chaos or confrontation, but with a calm that felt almost unnatural. And in that calm, the final shape of his legacy was beginning to take form. By the time Carmine reached this stage of his life, silence had become his closest companion. Not the uncomfortable kind. He had learned long ago how to sit with his own thoughts, but the kind that follows when a man is no longer at the center of motion. The calls still came, but they came later. The updates still arrived, but after decisions had already been shaped. Carmine was informed, not consulted. And yet, strangely, the world did not collapse. That realization stayed with him. For decades, Carmine had believed, had known, that his presence was essential. That without his firm hand, everything would fracture. Disorder would creep in. Mistakes would multiply. But now he watched from a slight distance as systems continued to operate, as people adapted, as the machine he had helped build learned how to run without him. It unsettled him more than any challenge ever had. Not because he had been wrong, but because he had been temporary. Carmine began to move differently. He no longer rushed. He no longer filled silence with instruction. He allowed conversations to pass without correction, even when he disagreed. Some mistook this restraint for wisdom. Others assumed it meant resignation. In truth, it was something deeper. Carmine was taking stock. He reflected on the choices that had defined him, the firmness that became rigidity, the authority that became isolation. None of it had been accidental. Every step made sense at the time. Every decision had protected him, strengthened him, elevated him. But success, he realized, carries a hidden cost. It trains you to trust your own certainty above all else. The world, however, does not reward certainty forever. It rewards those who adjust just before adjustment becomes necessary. Carmine had adjusted too late, not because he couldn't see the change, but because he believed his foundation was immune to it. He thought often of the men who once sat where he now stood, older figures he had quietly replaced, convinced they failed because they were weak or slow. Now he understood the truth they had never spoken. They hadn't lost because they lacked strength. They lost because the world no longer needed their version of it. As time passed, Carmine's presence became symbolic rather than functional. His name still carried weight, but it no longer directed movement. It framed the past more than the future, and Carmine accepted that. Not easily, not happily, but honestly. He stopped trying to correct the current and focused instead on preserving dignity. He knew that clinging too hard would only tarnish what remained. Influence could be lost quietly or loudly.
Carmine chose quietly.
That choice surprised many. Those who expected resistance found none. Those who anticipated defiance encountered calm. Carmine no longer needed to prove anything. The proof of his life already existed, etched into decades of history. What remained was interpretation. He spent more time away from the center, more time reflecting than directing. Some days he felt lighter. Other days, the absence of urgency felt like emptiness. But even that emptiness taught him something important. A man is more than the role he occupies. Late one evening, Carmine sat alone, watching the city breathe beneath him. Lights flickered. Cars moved steadily. Conversations unfolded without his knowledge or consent. And yet, he felt no bitterness, only a quiet understanding. Power, he realized, is not something you own. It is something you borrow for a time. And when the time ends, the measure of a man is not how fiercely he holds on, but how he lets go. Carmine Galante had reached that moment. The final chapter was no longer about control. It was about legacy. The final chapter did not arrive with drama. There were no sudden announcements, no sharp turns, no moments that demanded attention. Instead, it unfolded the way most endings do in real life. Quietly, almost respectfully, as if the world itself understood that some stories deserved a softer closing. Carmine continued his days much as he always had, though the weight they carried was different now. He woke early, kept his routines, maintained appearances when necessary. To those who saw him only occasionally, nothing seemed amiss. He was still, composed, still sharp, still unmistakably Carmine Galante. But inside, he had changed. He no longer measured time by influence or control. He measured it by clarity, by how well he understood the road behind him and how little he needed to control the road ahead. He thought often about legacy, not in terms of reputation, but meaning. What did it mean to have shaped so much, only to step aside while it continued without you? Was that failure, or was it success taken to its natural conclusion? Carmine came to believe it was neither. It was reality. He had played his role fully, intensely, without hesitation, and when the world required a different rhythm, it moved forward as it always does. Not out of disrespect, but necessity. What surprised him most was the absence of regret. He didn't wish he had been softer. He didn't wish he had compromised more. Every decision he made had been made with the information, instincts, and values he possessed at the time. To judge those choices by a future he couldn't have predicted felt dishonest. Instead, he accepted them. Carmine began to fade from conversations, from speculation, from concern. New names filled the space he once occupied. New strategies replaced old certainties. And slowly, his presence became a reference point rather than a factor. He had become history, and history, he realized, carries a strange kind of peace. It no longer needs to defend itself. It no longer competes. It simply exists, waiting to be understood. On quiet evenings, Carmine would sit and observe the city he had known so well. It looked the same, yet felt entirely different, like a place remembered rather than lived in. He felt no resentment toward it. Cities, like people, evolve. They cannot afford sentimentality. Neither could he. In those moments, Carmine understood something that had eluded him for most of his life. Strength is not only measured by dominance, but by acceptance. By knowing when your chapter has said what it needed to say. His story was never about chaos or noise. It was about order, control, and certainty in an uncertain world. And while that world had moved on, the imprint of his presence remained. Quiet, undeniable, permanent. Carmine Galante did not vanish. He concluded, and as the city continued to hum beneath the passing of time, his legacy settled into its place. Not as a warning, not as a myth, but as a reminder of what it means to stand firmly in one era and step back when another begins. That was how his story ended. Not loudly, but completely. Even as Carmine Galante receded from the center of attention, the world around him continued to evolve, reshaping itself in ways he had once dictated, and now simply observed. By this point, he had become more a symbol than an active force, a man whose presence was felt in the undercurrents of the city rather than the immediate decisions that shaped its streets. Yet, Carmine did not regard this as weakness. He understood deeply that influence could exist without visibility, that authority did not always need to manifest in commands or confrontations. In these quieter days, Carmine's mind worked differently. Where before he had calculated steps and moves, anticipating every potential shift, now he observed patterns, absorbed details, and reflected on the interplay of personalities and power that had defined his life. It was a slower, subtler kind of control, one rooted in understanding rather than action. He realized that the true legacy of a man like himself was not in the transactions, the victories, or even the fears he inspired, but in the echoes left behind, how systems, structures, and people adapted to what he had set in motion. He watched younger figures emerge, bold and restless, eager to carve paths that were theirs alone. Their strategies were different from his. Their methods were swifter, less structured, relying more on opportunism than discipline. He recognized brilliance in some of them, recklessness in others. And while he was no longer dictating the rules, he silently acknowledged that the city's survival, in a way, depended on them learning the hard lessons he had once mastered through years of meticulous observation and calculated risk. Occasionally, Carmine would meet with old associates, men whose lives had intertwined with his for decades. They spoke of changes, of victories, and of disappointments. Carmine listened more than he spoke. His words were measured, deliberate, carrying weight because they were few. He had learned that wisdom was not in filling silence, but in using it. These interactions reminded him that his influence, though invisible in daily operations, still lingered. Decisions were shaped in part by precedent, by respect, and by fear, even when unspoken. Yet, There was a certain loneliness in this form of existence. Carmine had spent his life surrounded by action, tension, and immediacy. Every moment demanded attention, every movement required calculation. Now, even though the city continued to pulse with life, he experienced a different rhythm, a cadence of quiet reflection and subtle awareness. He no longer needed to respond to every challenge. He no longer needed to prove anything. The city, the men, and even the laws of the streets had shifted. And he had shifted with them not by necessity, but by choice. During one particularly long evening, Carmine walked through a familiar part of the city, observing the neighborhoods that had once been under his close supervision. The streets had changed. Buildings had shifted. Businesses had closed and reopened under new ownership. Faces had changed. Yet beneath the surface, he could see patterns he had once taught himself to recognize. The alliances forming, the rivalries simmering, the rhythms of trust and loyalty. He smiled faintly, not out of amusement, but in recognition. The world kept moving as it always had, and he still understood it more deeply than most. In these moments, Carmine reflected on the nature of control itself. Power, he realized, is never absolute. It is fluid, ephemeral, and often misunderstood. What mattered most was not how tightly one could grip it, but how skillfully one could navigate its ebb and flow. For decades, he had grasped, shaped, and commanded, often through fear, sometimes through respect, occasionally through inspiration. Now, he watched and understood, appreciating the elegance of subtle influence over overt dominance. He also recognized the inevitability of change in a way he had never fully accepted before. Every empire, no matter how meticulously built, eventually faces the reality of time. New generations bring new rules. New strategies redefine old norms. Even the sharpest, most disciplined minds cannot stop the passage of change. They can only ride its currents, adjusting subtly to maintain relevance, safety, or legacy. Carmine had done this once in youth through direct action. Now, in maturity, he did it through observation and reflection. Despite his quieter existence, Carmine remained a figure of reverence and caution. Stories of his decisiveness, his strategies, and his methods continued to circulate among those who had known him or studied his influence. In boardrooms, corners of neighborhoods, and even among young men testing boundaries, his name was invoked as a standard of strategic precision and survival. It was a name that commanded consideration, not because it was feared, but because it carried undeniable history and enduring wisdom. Even so, Carmine no longer measured his worth by recognition or compliance. He understood that authority, once established, evolves. Respect is inherited by deeds, not demanded by presence. Control is not static, and the ability to guide outcomes subtly can be as impactful as direct command. This was a lesson he embraced fully, moving through life without the need to assert dominance outwardly, allowing the world to continue its natural course while still, remaining acutely aware of its undercurrents. In his private moments, Carmine reflected on his legacy, not with pride or regret, but with understanding. Every decision he had made, every alliance forged, every risk calculated, had led him to this point, a place of quiet comprehension. He had survived and thrived in a world defined by volatility, and though he no longer dictated its daily operations, his influence lingered in the structure he had helped establish and in the minds of those who had once been his peers and now his successors. Carmine Galante had reached a rare state. He was no longer defined by the pursuit of power, but by the mastery of perspective. The world continued to move, and though he was no longer its central actor, he understood its every turn with clarity few could match. That understanding brought a calm certainty. For the first time in decades, he felt complete, not as a ruler, but as a man who had observed, influenced, and survived with precision. As the city lights shimmered beneath him on long nights, Carmine knew that influence, legacy, and wisdom often outlast direct action. The world would continue, new names would rise, and history would evolve. And through it all, he remained a constant. A witness, a strategist, a reminder of what it meant to understand the rhythms of power deeply, even when the spotlight no longer shone directly on him. Carmine Galante's story, now beyond urgency, beyond command, and beyond immediate influence, existed in the interplay of what was done, what was observed, and what remained. It was a story not of noise, but of enduring presence, a quiet, measured influence that could outlast the passage of time itself. And as he reflected on the arc of his life, he realized that mastery had never been about control alone. It had been about comprehension, patience, and the ability to adapt even when the world shifted beneath your feet. In the final measure, Carmine understood that power fades, but understanding endures. History forgets the brash, but remembers the calculated. And while his active influence had waned, Carmine Galante remained present in every lesson, every strategy, every subtle movement that defined the city he had once helped shape. The city continued to breathe, move, and evolve, and Carmine, standing quietly at its edge, was at peace, observing, comprehending, and understanding the intricate dance of life that continued long after the era of his dominance had passed. Carmine Galante's final days of influence were not marked by fanfare or spectacle. The streets no longer shifted at the hint of his movement, the meetings no longer paused at his arrival, and the men who once waited for his word now acted with quiet confidence, guided more by instinct than by instruction. The city, vibrant and relentless, had moved on, but Carmine remained its attentive observer, a man whose understanding of the world had deepened beyond action into insight. He spent mornings walking familiar neighborhoods, noting the changes that time had wrought. Buildings he once frequented had new owners. Streets he had navigated with calculated precision now flowed with an almost careless rhythm, as if the city itself had grown younger and more daring. Children played in parks he once crossed quickly, and shopkeepers laughed over deals he would never oversee. Carmine watched silently, absorbing every detail, understanding that life continued without him, yet somehow carried traces of what he had built. His evenings were quieter, filled with reflection. Carmine considered the men who had once surrounded him, trusted associates, ambitious peers, and occasional adversaries. He thought of alliances forged in smoke-filled rooms, conversations carried in whispers, and decisions made in the precise balance between opportunity and caution. Each memory was a lesson, not just for him, but for anyone willing to observe the patterns of survival and success. He understood now that power was fleeting, but the understanding of power, its rhythm, its flow, its subtle cues, was lasting. Occasionally, old friends visited. They did not come seeking guidance or direction. They came to share stories, to remember. Carmine listened. He offered quiet insights, reflections that spoke not of control but of comprehension. His words carried weight because they were few and deliberate, shaped by years of experience and tempered by the understanding that influence could exist without assertion. These conversations, simple in appearance, left impressions far deeper than any order or command ever could. Carmine thought often about the younger version of himself, the man who had fought tooth and nail to rise, who had demanded attention and shaped his world through unyielding action. That man would have found this quiet existence frustrating, even unbearable. But the older Carmine understood something the younger could not. Influence does not require constant assertion, and presence does not require dominance. Sometimes true mastery lies in observation, patience, and the ability to let the world move while still understanding it fully. The men who had once relied on him had carved their own paths. Some had succeeded brilliantly, others struggled, but all were part of a web he had helped shape. Carmine recognized the subtle ways his influence persisted, not in overt control, but in decisions that bore the mark of the strategies he had once championed, in alliances that followed the rules he had silently enforced, in patterns of trust and caution that mirrored his own instincts. Legacy, he realized, was not always visible. Sometimes it was felt, embedded in the fabric of a world that had learned, knowingly or unknowingly, to echo the lessons of its past. Carmine spent nights thinking about power, not as the raw force he had once wielded, but as a nuanced, flowing entity that could be shaped, guided, and understood. He reflected on how power shifts quietly, how respect can turn into tradition, how fear can evolve into caution, and how influence can persist long after direct control has faded. He recognized the inevitability of change, the necessity of adaptation, and the elegance of patience. Despite stepping back from active dominance, Carmine maintained a presence in subtle ways. Conversations around decisions, choices made in his absence, even the unspoken acknowledgement among younger men, all carried the imprint of his understanding. He had become a guide without authority, a mentor without title, a strategist whose battlefield was now history itself. And in this, he found a strange satisfaction. He no longer measured his days by conquest or command, but by comprehension. Each observation, each reflection, each memory was a reinforcement of what he had achieved, not through fear or overt authority, but through mastery of insight and understanding. He saw the city, the men, and the lives around him as a complex puzzle, one he could still read with clarity even if he no longer moved the pieces. One quiet evening, Carmine stood on a familiar street corner, looking out over the city he had navigated so many times before. Neon lights shimmered in puddles, cars moved steadily, pedestrians passed without notice. He felt no need to intervene, no urge to command. The city would continue, as it always had, shaped by countless hands, each moving with intention and instinct. And yet, in every pattern, in every choice, in every subtle echo of strategy and caution, his presence lingered. Carmine realized that influence had never been about being at the center of attention. It had been about understanding, predicting, guiding, even invisibly. And while his era of dominance had ended, his understanding persisted, woven into the decisions, the alliances, and the instincts of those who had learned from him, knowingly or not. He thought back on the life he had lived, the battles, the victories, the careful calculations, the moments of quiet, triumph, the strategies executed with precision. All of it had led him here, to a state of complete comprehension, where the world moved with independence, yet carried his lessons in its very motion. Carmine's final reflection was simple, yet profound. Power fades, influence remains. Control diminishes, understanding endures. And in that understanding lay the true measure of a life lived with precision, discipline, and insight. As the city hummed beneath the night sky, Carmine Galante stood quietly, no longer the force that shaped every moment, but the presence that had left an indelible mark on all that moved around him. His story, fully lived, had reached its natural conclusion, not in noise or confrontation, but in quiet mastery, observation, and enduring comprehension. And with that, the chapter closed.